so much for joining us today. This is a really special opportunity to taste some of the finest Cabernets made not only in Sonoma but in California. And you have here the people responsible for it. And a collection of people like this and wines like this is not something most of us get to taste very often. So I'm joined today by photographer and founding winemaker of Laurel Glen Vineyard, Patrick Campbell. And here next, yeah, thank you. He made all of this happen in the first place. Randall Watkins, who's now the winemaker at Laurel Glen Vineyard. Phil Coturri, who's Phil Coturri, who's the viticulturist, and then finally Bettina Sichel, who is the owner of Laurel Glen Vineyard since 2011. And I think taken together, they kind of tell a beautiful story of the evolution of California Cabernet over the last 3 decades. I really think these wines are an exceptional example of wines that have stayed true to their terroir and that didn't fall victim to the tides of fashion. And you'll taste, I think, throughout the decades that they really always, throughout the different winemakers, different farmers, taste like Laurel Glen.
And then I bought what was known as Laurel Glen, which was a 3-acre vineyard at that point. That part had been planted in 1968. There were other vines in there that were planted in the probably the 1880s, 1890s at least, going back. So, you know, this has been a very, very old vineyard area up on Sonoma Mountain. They know how to make wine, so I thought I might as well reduce all the variables as much as I possibly could. So we reduced the variables to one variety, Cabernet Sauvignon, grown in one site right here, and made the same basically year in and year out until we sort of figured it out after about a decade.
I love that there's a lot of earthy, leathery, but still so much freshness in these wines. Very Bordeaux-like. I wouldn't pick these as California, tasting them blind, and holding up remarkably well. There's a wildness and a rusticity that I really love, and the texture of these wines are fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this still has a kind of core of bright red fruit that tastes really fresh. It doesn't taste tired at all in any way.
In those days, we didn't know about over 14% alcohol picking, and certainly didn't know about 15 and 16% alcohol picking. We picked when at about 12.5 for these.
Vineyard naturally produces wines that are going to have a low pH, even with long hang time. Many, many hours of ripening, which gives you the complexity, but never getting into the very low acid, high pH kind of realm that a hotter site would have.
84 was just a dream for a vineyard grower and a winemaker. It just has a little bit more ripeness to go. We were still picking at very low alcohols, very low potential alcohols, but the ripeness was there in the grapes to really give it a little more flesh than, say, the 81.
It has so much darker fruit components to me. It almost has that kind of coffee, like a roasted coffee thing.
In 24 months, brand new French oak barrels, every wine in the early days. And I don't think anybody here is going to find a lot of oak in these. And how it survived that assault from brand new French oak barrels, I have no idea. But I think it speaks to the quality of the fruit up here.
We weren't manipulating the canopies like we do. We weren't balancing the canopies as much. Earlier today we talked about there was a California sprawl. So instead of a vertical system, you had this big umbrella of foliage over it, and you take out some of these around the fruit zone, but you didn't do a lot of work on the fruit during the growing season. And so you get along a slower ripening curve, and with the spacing of the vines at that point, they weren't as high density as we have now, and you tend to, the fruit doesn't get quite as ripe, but it produces wines that really have a Bordelais style.
Mary, that this was the first year you used native fermentations.
Again, another effort at reducing the variables. I figured that there must be some sort of indigenous yeast in these vineyards, and let's use it. Let's experiment and see what happens. We got away with it because, again, we didn't put too many variables in it. We had one vineyard, one winemaking style, and we thought, well, I think we can probably see what we can do with indigenous yeast, and it was a very good call.
But the beginning of it is when there's the risk reward of having that complexity in aromatics and mouth and different flavors that you wouldn't get just by adding this store-bought freeze-dried yeast that Patrick was talking about that most wineries would be using.
Let's go ahead and taste the 86, which, Patrick, was this your favorite year of the 80s?
Definitely, yeah. It was a nice even ripening year. I thought we could probably put a little more flesh on the bones, beginning with about 86. And I think it shows nicely. I think it's still has aging potential, but is very attractive. It's a nice wine, nice drinking wine. I always like this wine a lot.
Robert Parker tasted this wine, so it was 10 years old at the time, and he wrote, I thought it was the 1982 Léoville Las Casses, which is one of the great Bordeaux from the great vintage.
So I'd like to just point out the color saturation between 84 and 86. To me, you know, the color of these wines has always been something I've been really proud of, how well they age color-wise, how slowly the color deteriorates. And I think between 84 and 86, you see this really, you know, impressive improvement in saturation.
Yeah, where I saw more the sage and herbal in the 81, and then the leathery kind of cigar smoked meat in the 84. This one, it had tobacco leaf, definitely that leathery, and a little bit of kind of gauze-like that would be, there's some Brettanomyces influence in this one, and
Yeah, I mean, it kind of presents as a really actually attractive, earthy character, I think, here.
By 86, we had, say, 6 or 7 different lots of wine that we could choose from. So we could blend a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this.
So the 90, to me, this wine, this is kind of a different level of polish than the 80s had. This has a little more opulence. I mean, it's got some of that really delicious kind of unctuous cassis flavor.
So I just want to point out that this vintage was poured out of a 6-liter. Vanna will be walking around with.
This was my probably all-time favorite wine, I've got to say.
Wow, that's quite a statement.
yeah, lots of dried cherry and cranberry in this, anise. More tannin grip, I think, than the wines of the 80s. This is certainly seems super fresh and lively.
Yeah, I mean, do you all notice
19
just
years.
the kind of grip in your mouth? It's like a young wine.
Yeah, 94 was extremely warm here.
Yeah,
Early vintage.
yeah. It was probably a little riper than we'd like, but I always like this wine, and you know, it's a little more macho than what happened previously, shall we say. So it's a little more alcoholic than what our style would normally be. But, you know, you got to roll with the punches. I mean, you know, a year like this, you got to deal with the rain. A year like that, you got to deal with the heat. And to some extent, you have to take what you got.
When did you start field crushing?
Oh, God, almost immediately. Normally, you bring the grapes to the winery and you crush them and process them at the winery. What we did is we picked the grapes in the vineyard. Obviously, everybody does that. And it goes right to the crusher stemmer at that point. So they're turned into a skins and seeds. You know, they're crushed at that point. If it keeps it, I think it probably keeps it fresher. I mean, it might be too fine a point on it, but
Being a little bigger and higher in alcohol, this wine has just a kind of piercing acidity. I mean, it's amazing to have both of those at the same time, and I think that's why it tastes so fresh.
The beauty of the Sonoma Mountain AVA, when the harvest comes September, October, when they get the warm winds coming eastern winds coming in, Sonoma Mountain still has the cooling effect of the bay. Dry air, the lack of humidity that occurs during the daytime, but those fresh nights really help maintain that.
When you have tannin, high tannin and high acidity at the same time, they can amplify each other. And in this 94 in particular, I am projecting that it would have taken about 10 years for this to really come around. And so it had high amounts of both, and really it's a big wine because of it even still.
96. And this was another warm year, right?
Yeah.
These wines taste 15 years younger than they are, maybe. I mean,
Yeah.
at least. It's just the freshness. You could imagine this being a 5, 10, 15-year-old wine, not a 20-year-old wine.
A lot of high tone notes to this. Raspberry, it's very fresh but not tart. I think lower acidity than the wine before. And so this one actually would seem a little bit older than the 94, but still holding up amazingly. The oak is so well integrated. Really nice wine.
But I think the basic message of these is these wines have such structure and such fruit integrity, if you will, to them that they can absorb that amount of oak.
In Sonoma Valley, there wasn't that many wineries, and I always looked at it on the Sonoma Mountain side, you had Laurel Glen, and on the Mayakama side, you had Cabernet. And you guys were trailblazers in putting together what great Cabernet could be coming out of here.
The 99, and this was one of the few wines, Patrick, that you called reserve.
Well, in the 3 years that we did reserve wines, one of those fermenter lots was so superior to the rest that we just couldn't resist. Separating it out, making possibly even 100 cases of reserve wines.
To me, this wine doesn't quite have the acidity of some of the vintages we just tasted, but I still love its kind of plushness, and it's got really kind of unctuous fruit characters. It's delicious.
I thought it had the very perfumed nose, or the boysenberry and cassis character to this one, and very dark fruit, more darker than some of the prior ones as well.
Let's taste the 03. This wine gets for me into a lot more savory characters than what we've just seen in the last couple of vintages.
This wine was a huge wine. When it was younger, it was just amazingly tannic, and every year this has just become more and more elegant and smooth, I think. But I love this wine.
Put it on a piece of white paper and look at the rim. I mean, obviously compare it to 81, for example. The 81 looks sort of brown and orange. This one still is pretty purple with almost no brown.
Add to the age-worthiness of Laurel Glen wines are the mountain tannins and the acidity. So the lower pH, the slower the aging, and then the higher the tannins, the more antioxidant properties the wine has. The 03 is aged so well because of the higher tannin, and then the 06 because of the higher acidity. It doesn't have as much tannin, but it definitely has more acidity, and it's holding up very nicely, very fresh.
Yeah, the 06 has some of those kind of sandalwood, camphor. It's getting a little herbal. Were you picking very differently? Because these last two wines have just a great kind of herbal quality to me. In the 90s.
No, I don't think so.
With 2009, we start to get into the new era of Laurel Glen, because this was a wine that, Randall, you started in 2011 when Bettina took on Laurel Glen.
Yes.
And so you finished the wine?
Right, so when I was hired, the 2009 and 2010 wines were in barrel, and so I cared for them, and then ended up doing the blending and the bottling of the wines that Patrick and Ray had produced. This wine, I think, a lot more kind of vanilla and coconut in there, which was interesting. I thought it was pretty viscous, and a lot of cherry fruit. Also, very youthful in the Laurel Glen tradition, I think.
It wasn't until I went up to Laurel Glen, spent an afternoon with Patrick, walking through the vineyard, tasting his wines, that I had kind of that eureka moment. And I have to say, I feel so fortunate to be the steward of what I consider to be a very special Cabernet vineyard.
It's really rare to have this kind of continuity and to have a initial founder and then the new owner who are here doing retrospective tastings together. You really don't see that very often. Bettina, you purchased Laurel Glen in 2011, and so the 11 is the first vintage start to finish in your hands. And what a strange vintage to start with. Like the coldest, rainiest vintage.
Sort of like
We made many, many changes to pruning and trellising in 2011, and in retrospect, we could not have timed it better.
11 is probably one of the most difficult growing seasons that I ever had to deal with. Just we re-trellised the vineyard, got a little more vertical. It was vertical, but we opened up put cross arms on it to get a little more airflow, and air circulation, a little more filtered sunlight, changes, and it increases the phenolics in growing grapes. California viticulture, as it constantly improved, the wines were great to begin with, but the flavors and the brightness starts to appear through changes in the viticulture.
So then we get to 2012, a kind of return to normalcy in California weather. And you called this Lot 44.
Randall and I developed what we call the Lot series. So this is a few barrels from each vintage. In 2012, I think it was 6 barrels. In 2014, I think it was 4 barrels. And essentially, it is the barrels which are most reminiscent of that style, that slightly more, that less refined style, that more.
It's a little bit of that sauvage, kind of wild herb character.
Yes, with much more grippy tannins.
Yeah.
I don't know, I like to say more punch.
It's kind of a chewy wine structurally. I mean, it's like there's substance there. It's grippy.
So I chose the starting number as 44 because 2012 is the 44th year since Cabernet was planted in the vineyard. There's always something in the portfolio which will taste today the way 1990 does in 20 years.
The 2014 wine is called Lot 46.
This place gets long hours of sun and flavor development over time without having the very high bricks and low acidity that long hang time might otherwise give if you're in a hotter site. So flavor is going up with physiological ripeness. I've continued with many of the same production methods that Patrick uses. One change is a little more sorting, so we're doing cluster sorting and berry sorting at the winery, but usually about 4, 5, 6 ton fermentations, which is what Laurel Glen has always been, and a mixture of hand punching down of the cap and gentle irrigations during the maceration and fermentation time to extract the color and flavors.
2014 has not yet been released. That's the Lot 46, but the 2015, which is it's not the lot, it's just the regular Laurel Glen. This is the current release. This is what's being sold out in the market right now.
15 was the smallest vintage, I think, as far as tonnage in history. There was some crazy storms during flower and a lot of shatter, real small crop, real hot year.
As a winemaker, sometimes we like the smaller crop and tiny little berries because you do get really concentrated, beautiful wines.
But yeah, it's really concentrated.
Really concentrated.
Beautiful. 2017, this is in barrels.
And that's in this glass was picked before the fires. Special about these wines is their ageability, but the flip side of that is when they are young, the wines from the particularly 90s and aughts, they take a long time in the bottle to achieve this kind of beautiful balance.
I had loved Patrick's wines so much, and to take on from the history that he had created and of quality, and just this persistence of terroir and sense of place in his wines that you've seen here today. First hired, people ask me, well, are you going to change everything? Or you're the new guy. And so I found this thing that I wrote to answer some of these people's questions. What I said to them was, the stylistic goal continues to be elegance without over-extraction, balance of acidity and fruit ripeness, finesse and ageability. And I think, all these wines have shown a lot of those components that are the goals of both Patrick and myself.